Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. I am happy to be joined by Dan and Chad very shortly, who are going to discuss Dan's last book on his Petra Thesis. You may or may not remember, but Dan was the very first guest that I had on this channel. And I thought, since this is kind of the end of his intellectual project with the publication of his final book, we might have a chance to talk about it. And so he'll be coming on to discuss it. However, I'm having all kinds of IT problems. As you can probably see, I'm totally out of focus. And the reason for that is that I have a new camera. It's so brand spanking new that I haven't quite figured out how to set it up properly yet. And so that's the reason why I'm out of focus. I also, earlier today, had the blue screen of computer death on my computer. And so at any time, I fear that my computer may die on me. And so this is going to be an interesting live stream, because I'm going to be keeping my fingers crossed in the midst of trying to sort out all my IT stuff, to make sure that I could try and get online to do this live stream. I didn't get to do some basic prep for this live stream, so you'll probably pick up on that as we go into it. All that being said, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dan and Chad. How are you doing, guys?
Good.
I'm doing well.
Did you, in the back studio, can you hear what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Good. So you heard it. You heard what I had to say. Fantastic. Mm-hmm. So we're going to obviously be talking about your is it your final book? This is the last book that you published.
I've written a lot of books over the years. I will write more books. It's my final book on this topic because it has exhausted, I think, the research field, and it's exhausted me. And so I'd like to move on to other things.
Brilliant. That is fair enough. So before we begin, then, it's good to have you back. And it's nice to have you, Chad. Do you just want to introduce yourself? Because the last time Dan was on my channel, you weren't with him. So,
yeah, when Dan was looking to begin this last book, Let the Stone Speak, he thought he should bring on an editor, and I was available. But that editing process, as it sometimes does with these projects, I also did research, and I wrote a couple of chapters of the book. So that sort of expanded, and our partnership has continued now that the book has been finished. And so that's how I became involved.
The whole question was how to present what I had found over the last 14, 15 years of research, and trying to put it all together in a book. And Chad, with his degrees in English and his thought and his interest in the Middle East, really helped come on board and put that whole thing together.
Fantastic. Great stuff. Well, glad to have you both then. As you know, we always begin with a psalm as a prayer, and I have to get into the habit now of looking up here and not on my screen like I'm used to doing. So the screen is now down here, but the camera is there, and I've got to get into the habit of just looking at the camera, which means I'm essentially looking at myself. So, yes, would you like to just lead us in a prayer, Dan?
Sure. Okay. Psalm 100 is shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful song. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name, for the Lord is good, and his love endures forever, and his faithfulness continues throughout all generations.
This
Amen.
is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen. So, Dan, this is. Do you just want to maybe introduce the name of your book, show the cover to people, let people see the book? Do you have a copy with you?
I do not have a copy in front of me.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
We're both looking around.
Like, oh, we have a manuscript over there. The name of the book is Let the Stones Speak. And it is out in ebook format. The print book is still coming. They're still working on it. We have to rework the cover a little bit. And so it will be out soon. That's all I can promise. But the electronic copy, what's inside, is out already. And about 1,500 people have downloaded it in the last week or so. So, yeah, it's out there. Let the Stones Speak.
And where can people download it from?
Okay, now my website is nabatea.net. That's NABATAEA.net.
There we go. I bet there's going to be people having to go back and just have that played a couple of times before they get all those vowels in. So
the second one is always A.
So what was the what's the reason behind the title? Why did you go for that title?
Well, we'll explain it as we go along, that
okay.
In Islamic history, and I started this out looking at Islamic history years and years ago, trying to figure it out. And what we dealt with back then was manuscripts, and everybody deals with manuscripts. This is a chance for archaeology to speak. And so in the years when there were no manuscripts, that's the first 200 years of Islam, there is archaeological evidence. And so Let the Stones Speak is let the stones have a chance to say what happened in those first 200 years of Islamic history.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much for that. And just tell us, what was it that set you on this intellectual project?
Well, when I went out to the Middle East, I was probably, I think, 21 or something. It was years and years and years ago. I was interested in learning everything I could about the Middle East, about the people, about history. I was particularly interested, though, in the culture, the thinking, the worldview, the sociological and, sort of approach to understanding the Middle East. Part of that was history. And so as I went along, I would visit, some of these early mosques, and usually a guard or somebody who was there would say, now this mosque doesn't face Mecca, this mosque faced Jerusalem. And after hearing that, 5, 6, 8, 10 times, it's just like something's wrong here. And some of these mosques don't fit the timeline, because traditional Islam tells us that Muslims, when they moved to Medina, that they faced Jerusalem when they prayed, and they did that for 16 months. And then the the verse was revealed that they should turn their face towards a Qibla, a specific direction of prayer. And so they turned their faces to Mecca. And that's what traditional Islamic history tells us that. And I knew that all these mosques that I was seeing didn't fit the timeline. I knew it was a challenge. I didn't want to tackle it up front, but I figured eventually I would have to really ask those kinds of questions.
And my immediate thought, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, my immediate thought is, someone just built the buildings wrong, pointing in the wrong direction. Why is that not the simple solution to the problem?
It is the simple solution. I accepted that for about the first, I don't know how many years of doing this. Around the year 2000, I managed to get a hold of a GPS unit. And I got a hold of this because we were out in the desert and kept finding, graffiti or inscriptions on rocks. And I wanted to locate where they were. And just trying to write a description wasn't good enough. The early GPS units, I could get a fix of latitude and longitude within about 12 feet or 4 meters or whatever. So that was close enough in those days. So at least somebody could get back to that spot and see what was out there in the desert. That also helped me starting to figure out what is the Qibla direction of the different places of prayer that I came across. And they were wild. They were facing all kinds of different directions. And I thought either they didn't know or something's wrong. And so I thought I have to make a list. And I started making a list of mosques and the direction they faced. And that because there was no published list anywhere to go to. And it was just a private project. It was just my interest. But that list grew, and I knew something was off. And I had said to my wife, I need to, if I'm going to really get into this, I need to take a year and work on it. Well, an opportunity came to take a sabbatical, the year 2009, 2010. And that's when I said, I'm going to focus on my sabbatical on reading all about this and try to figure out what's going on. And that's when I first discovered that many of these mosques face Petra. And I remember after 4 months of doing this, saying to my wife, at the beginning, I said, I think this is going to be like a conspiracy theory. You're going to gather all this data. But at the end of 4 months, I said to her, I don't think this is a conspiracy theory. I think there's enough evidence here that demonstrates that the first mosques all faced northern Arabia, and it looks like the city of Petra. And that started the whole thing.
So tell us more then about what the thesis is, and upon what does the thesis stand, the argument stand?
Yeah, I could speak to that a little bit.
Ahead.
One of the interesting things that Dan is tackling in this last book, and I've been able to help him address, is the thesis has sort of moved a few degrees. The thesis is less trying to prove the data than it once was. We still pay some attention to that. But we've had assistance from other scholars, including statisticians, who have been able to test the data, and the data is quite sound. And in fact, Dan's database has grown to such a degree, and it still fits the pattern that the data isn't really the issue anymore. Dan has a critic in one Dr. King who has quite aggressively gone after him in his scholarship and has published numerous papers on Dan's work and the Petra Qibla. And even Dr. King will say that these mosques do indeed face Petra. He just thinks it's incidental. So the data isn't the thesis as much as it once was. We've sort of moved a little bit further down the road, and now we're trying to say, given what the stones are telling us, what the stones are speaking, what are the arguments we can form in order to explain this? Because it's one thing to identify multiple Qiblas in early Islam, and it's a whole nother task to try to explain how this came to be with a lack or with a struggle with manuscript evidence. And so that's the sort of wild project we've taken on with this one.
So there's in our minds, a big difference between the data and how we explain the data. So the data stands as its own. I started out with like a dozen mosques. By the time I wrote Quranic geography, I had a chapter on Mecca and where was it. And I threw in some of this stuff just to sort of introduce the topic. And that really took off. A lot of people bought the book because of that chapter and a couple of chapters following trying to explain it. But I still only had like 30 mosques back then that I was looking at the data from. Well, we grew that up to 2017 with the next book, Early Islamic Qiblas. There we had around 100 mosques, maybe more than 100 mosques. And so it grew. But now the database has reached over 250 mosques. And so, I mean, these are mosques from the first couple of centuries, 2 to 3 centuries into Islamic history. So just the first 200 or 300 years. And so we have a much better picture of what was going on, because we're not only looking at the Qibla direction, we're looking at when was this mosque built, where was it built, and and how and what the style and the size of the mosque. I mean, there's a lot of things we can pull out of the database now that we have a significant number of mosques. We can see where Muslim armies had moved by that time, where they had been established. And so we can begin to compare that data with the traditional account, with the manuscripts, and try to pull together the story of what is actually happening. And that challenges us. It challenges Muslims. It challenges the revisionists who are out there trying different theories. I mean, this is a new set of data that needs to be explained. And so when somebody comes along and says, I disagree, we say, that's fine. You disagree with my theory, but you have to address the data. How do you explain 60 mosques all facing in one direction? How do you explain over 40 mosques facing in another direction? And so that's the challenge. My explanation, our explanation, may not be correct. I mean, we're trying to look and figure out why, but the data still is there, and that's the struggle that everyone has. They have to come and explain, why are these mosques like that? Why are there distinct patterns that are there that people like statisticians have come along and pulled out some of these and done some amazing things with the data. And so the data stands as far as we're concerned until somebody comes along and disproves it. But then the thesis of what happened, that, needs to be looked at by everybody. But we're really hoping that the data gets accepted and people will look at it and say, okay, there's the data. Now, what do we do with it? Does that make sense?
Let me just repeat back to you what I think I understand, and then you can correct me where I've picked up some wrong ideas. So you've got about 250 mosques from the first 200 years of Islamic history that aren't facing towards Mecca; they're facing towards Petra.
Some are facing towards Mecca. Okay. That's where we have to put up a timeline. I don't know if we could throw it up now and show you the timeline. Okay, there you go. So what you see in this timeline, look at the black line across the middle of it. This is the timeline moving to the right. So we're starting with 0. We use the Islamic dates. We've thrown in the Western dates along with it. But you can see at the top of this chart are manuscripts, and this is where we're talking about where the manuscripts are found. And the bottom are places of prayer that we have examined. So across the top, we have where some of the manuscripts are. You see, there are 200 years missing in manuscript history. There's no eyewitnesses from those years. What we have as we get along later is we have people who are trying to explain the previous 200 years to us. And so they're writing too late, and they're trying to explain. Each one of them have a slightly different take on it. And so some of them are just, good Muslim people. Others are like Al-Tabri over on the right there. He is a court historian. He writes down what's happening in the Abbasid courts. And so as he does that, he decides to fill in previous years. And he not only goes back in those 200 missing years, he keeps going back all the way to Abraham and all the way back to Adam. Okay, and he writes a complete history of the world, but he is an official recorder. So we need to pay attention to him as well as to others. But it's there, all we have is their explanations of what happened previously. Below on this chart at the bottom, we have, and particularly here, the places of prayer and the Qiblas. Now, there's lots of other data we can pull out, but here are the Qiblas because that's what struck us interesting at the very first. And so you can see that we have some Qiblas that are the Petra Qiblas, and they start right at the beginning, and they go over 100 years, and then they start to peter out. And in the middle of this, some Mecca Qiblas begin. The first 88 years of Islamic history, nothing faces Mecca in Saudi Arabia. But then another Qibla starts about the same time, and it's what we call the between Qibla. It points to a place between Petra and Mecca. And the first mosque that did this was called the Wasit Mosque, or the between or mosque. And so it's an actual direction that people use, and there are multiple mosques that use this. And then finally we have the parallel, which is done in North Africa, and it continues on for quite a few years, but fades out, in about 900 years after the Hijra. So almost 1,000 years those there survive.
And what's your explanation? Because we've got the standard narrative, which Dr. Yasukadi famously said had holes in it, and the standard narrative comes from the literature that we've got in the diagram, the various different things like from Ibn Hisham and Sahih al-Bukhari and Sunan Abu Dawud and so on and so forth. They give the explanation that just assumes Mecca was always the central point, not just of the Islamic origin story, but of the world origin story. What's your explanation then for the fact that the earliest Qiblas are pointing towards Petra, and that there seems to be different Qiblas at different periods, almost competing Qiblas at a certain point in Islamic history?
Well, you'll notice there are 4 competing Qiblas at one time in there at about 100 years once you're into Islamic history. I call it the time of confusion because there are 4 active Qiblas that are being used. So, excuse me. When you ask what is our opinion, now you're moving beyond the data, and now you're moving into what we think happened. And what we think happened is not empirical. It's not standing there. Yeah. It's what we think. That's why we split these up in the book and in our minds. Because I can tell you what I think is the data says, but and what I think the history says. But the question of what actually happened, that's the question we ask in the book. And that's why the book is as long as it is, because we go back and try to fit the bottom line with all these mosques in with the top line with all of the manuscripts. So an awful lot of what we quote in the book are these manuscripts, because we're recognizing they're trying to figure out what happened, but we have a clue of what happened from the archaeology. So how can we fit them together? And the basic question that you asked, we've gone back and looked, and we believe that the name Mecca was first applied to where Petra is. Petra is a name that was given to Mecca. It just means the rock. And so that was a name that people called it. But there are many other names that applied to Petra. And it wasn't even the name of the city. It was called Hadrian's Petra, Hadrian's Rock, by the Romans. And so the name caught on and everybody called it Petra. But that's not the name that the people called it. And so when we go back, we believe that we can find that the name Mecca was used originally for Petra as one of the many names that was used there. And there are writers who go back and use that name for that area. So when we read Islamic history later, the question is, which city are you talking to? It's like, are you talking about York in UK, or are you talking about New York in the United States? Okay, if they didn't put new in front of it and you had 2 Yorks, which one are you talking about? Where? And so you have to go back and decide when you're reading it, which of these Meccas are they talking about? The later writers, the early thing had been wiped out, and we explain why and how that the earlier thinking had disappeared. And that was done really sort of on purpose. There were people who went around. And so in Islamic history, as you read Al-Tabari, as you read Bukhari, they talk about the traditionalists and the reformers. And you'll find that throughout all of their writings. And so the traditionalists said this or thought this. 300 years later, they're writing about traditionalists. Okay, they are not back there at the time. And so Islam was split between these two. We're discovering a little bit about the traditionalists as we go back and look at the mosques and realize, wow, look at these. They really were split on some of these things. And traditionalists would have faced the original city, which all these mosques were facing Petra. And so they, as traditionalists, the others are reformers, and by the time that they're writing 300 years later, they're believing it all happened in Mecca in Saudi Arabia.
And it isn't surprising they would adopt that belief, or that later histories wouldn't describe a Qibla controversy, because the Qibla is such a fundamental part of Islamic prayer life, for the validity, even when you're butchering, or for the validity of prayers, you're to face the Qibla, which was provided by Allah. And so if there was a controversy there, then it's a little bit difficult to figure out what is legitimate for Muslims. And I think the solution to that was, it was Jerusalem for 15 years, and then it was always Mecca. And that sort of puts it to rest, except for the archaeological data. And now that we have GPSs and we can go verify these things, we're able to do what historians weren't able to do with surveys in the past. And that's only as of the year 2000.
We point out in the book that it's very interesting that all the way up into the 1970s, archaeologists were not measuring the orientation of mosques and other Islamic buildings. They just they didn't do it. It was a big gap there. It was just assumed they were trying to face Mecca, and maybe they got it wrong. Dr. King came along, and he had his explanations that, well, they adopted some bit or piece of maybe what they thought or what they saw in Mecca. Maybe used a wall, maybe used a corner, maybe used a star that was, in that direction at night. You stand there and look, oh, there's that star. When I get home, I'll pick that star, or something like that. And so he has many, many explanations of why mosques would be facing all over. But when we make the database, we recognized that there are patterns. This is not just, things facing, obscure directions by different people.
Yeah, 250 all facing in towards one city is not an easy coincidence, especially, I imagine, that 250 spread out.
They're over, they're spread out all over, and there are 4 of them, so there are about 60 that face Petra, and these are all the earliest mosques, very clearly faced.
Yeah, 60 facing Petra. That's quite a coincidence.
Yeah,
exactly, and that's what the statisticians have been finding. It is quite a coincidence. It's verifiable mathematically. So,
yeah. So, and would it be fair to say that then the archaeological evidence, the solid rock, the stone, what that is telling us, or at least what that is hinting or whispering to us in a very faint, distant voice, is that the standard narrative that we hear in the literature shouldn't just be taken for granted as being true.
Yes, but if you go back and read Petra into Mecca in some of them, suddenly things become clearer. It's not as if they were trying to hide it. I think they didn't understand it 300 years later. The narrative had been developed. The Abbasid caliphs wanted a solid narrative that defended Islam, and so that was the politically correct understanding of what happened. And so they've already done away with the traditionalists, and rather brutally, many of them were killed earlier on. And so that's another whole chapter in the book as we look at all these things. So there's a lot in the book that, but this chart here gives us the basis for what the book is all about.
And go on, Chad.
Even the fact that you have extant hadiths that have companions of Muhammad complaining everything's changed, the prayers have changed, or that great political leaders like Al-Hajjaj was persecuting them, was killing them, was putting lead seals around their necks. We're not brushing up against the histories. There's not a lot of conflict there. In fact, it helps to make it make sense what was at stake in this conflict in early Islam.
Interesting. So you're putting the blame of this reinvention of Islam, for want of a better description, you're putting it firmly at the door of the Abbasids.
No, it happened before the Abbasids. We're putting the blame on one person who really started to recognize, and there's a lot to this. So we're too early on in talking about this to get to who this guy is and why he did it and what all he did. But there was one guy who recognized Islam needed to be rebranded. It needed to be changed. And so he's the one who started that process, I believe. And I think it was picked up and followed by people over the next probably 60, 80, 100 years, and Islam was rebranded to the Islam we know today.
Interesting.
So
Okay, I'm hoping that the answer to my question will appear in this interview. Then
I'm hoping we get to it, because I mean, as you will find out, this book does not have a lot of filler in it. Okay. Some of the filler might be reading statistical reports from statisticians. Okay, it's like, okay, that's the chapter. You kind of look at the charts and move on through, because I'm not a mathematician. Those guys are. The two guys who worked on this, who did the chapter, they have over 120 peer-reviewed published papers between them. I mean, so they're not just nobodies. They're, you know, good statisticians who thought, oh, there's statistics here. We could look at this and pull it apart and see what it looks like. And they can tell if we stack the deck in one direction or another by looking at statistics. Because I was worried about, well, we have some that just don't fit anywhere. And he's like, yeah, that's normal. And, you know, and that's included in the data. So we have not tried to massage the data or change the data or make things happen. We've just tried to report, this is what we found.
Brilliant. So let's press on a bit, because you know this is a bit of an ode to you, really, and to your intellectual project. You know, so how many books have you written around this topic? And what does this new book cover that has not already been said in your other works?
Okay, if you're looking at just books, I first mentioned this in the book I was writing on the geography of the Quran. And on the chapter on Mecca, I came up with a question, because the Qiblas didn't seem to all face in the same direction. And then I gave a couple of chapters of looking at historical or literary evidence that they may have faced other places. And many of these were facing Petra at the earliest days. That was stuck at the end of the book. I didn't know how people would react. And the book was really written for friends and other people who were interested. I wasn't thinking it was going to take off. I wasn't thinking that we're going to sell thousands of copies or anything. It was just putting this together, and but actually publishing it. I wanted to, at that point, I had published a number of books in other genre. I wanted to, put it together into a nice presentation. So we did that as a hardcover book and put it out. It took off. I mean, people started contacting me from all over the place, lots of questions. And so during those years, a film company from the UK contacted me, the producer, and he said he looked at the material, said, we need to make a film about this. So we sat down and tried to hash out how we would do it and where the money would come from and all of that. Put together the film, The Sacred City. So that Sacred City was the second thing that came out. At the very same time we were working on that, I was still expanding this list of mosques and put together a book called Early Islamic Qiblas. And that was an explanation from 2017. So it's still early in the studies. But that book is there. It stands. You can look at it. But as we were going along, we were learning new things. So when I did Quranic geography, I didn't know the between Qibla even existed. It wasn't until we got enough mosques, and suddenly we're like, look, all of these mosques, and now to date we have over 40 mosques that are all facing in one place. And it's in the middle of Saudi Arabia, between Petra and Mecca, so we called it the Between Qibla. And so, I mean, these things started to emerge. And so we have some explanations on that there, but I still kept on working. About this time, I added YouTube videos. I thought to myself, I need to get out there and talk to and get more eyes, talk to people. And I specifically wanted people who lived in these other countries. And so I challenged people, Muslims especially, to go out, to find old mosques, go out and, and then email me and tell me about the mosque and where it is, so then I can go find it and look for archaeological reports and start to put together various data that are there. And so the list, because I realized I don't have a list. A good list. Early on, somebody accused me and said, you can't cherry pick. You can't just pick one mosque here and one mosque there. And I thought, no, I'm trying to get them all. But so I've really been concentrating up until this last year. Can I find all of the existing mosques from that time period? And so that has been a challenge. And we're still, I mean, every month or so, somebody comes up with and sends me something. And, oh, it's something I haven't seen. And so then I go out and have a look. But I ask my people, please look at the database. I had a guy send me, here's a mosque in India, and it goes on and on and on. And it's like, yeah, I was aware of that, like 10 years ago, and it's in the database. It's on the website. And so on the website, let's do this up early. There is something called the Qibla tool. If you go to nabatea.net and choose the founding of Islam out of the menu, you can click on the Qibla tool, and it gives you maps that you automatically zoom in. You can type a search for a particular mosque. You can search by the era that the mosques are in, like during the lifetime of Muhammad, or during the Umayyads, or the early Umayyads or the later Umayyads, during the Abbasid, and it will give you the mosques that were constructed at that time. You can go do that, or you can look by the Qiblas and choose which Qiblas, or you can, and then there are maps, and you can zoom out and look at the maps. It shows where the Qibla direction is. The data is all there on the web. People just need to go and look at it. When you find a mosque that's of interest, click on more information. A web page will open up. It will give you some more information about it. So we really, and I'm still trying to get all of the information up there, because we have to update it all the time as new reports come out, as archaeologists do more digging in different places and try to put that all on the web. So that'll be, just going to say that'll be my project for years to come.
Does the new book tweak your own hypothesis, your own narrative as to what you think was happening, or from the first time that you came on my channel?
Yes,
over a year ago. Now, is the narrative that you suggested then still the same?
It's much more complete. We're getting a much more complete picture of what is going on. Early on, we knew what had happened, and that there were all these mosques, but we didn't know who, and we didn't know why, So we knew what, and we knew when mosques were built, but we didn't understand the narrative around it very well. That is becoming much, much clearer to us.
You're still teasing the shadowy figure behind this event without actually giving it away. I take it we're not quite there yet.
Okay, so no, you're not quite there yet. Why don't we bring up, because we can extrapolate a lot of data. Why don't you bring up the next chart, because it'll explain.
You're sharing. This is you sharing. This on the screen.
Oh, that's us.
You're sharing that. So
okay, there we go.
I'm working on it. Yep.
Yeah. There we go. If it makes you feel any better, Dan, I'm a complete technophobe as well, and I have so many people helping me in so many ways. Someone's going to help me focus this camera in at some point. So
it should be available to you now.
All right, bear with us while I just get there we go.
Okay, this is a timeline very similar to the last timeline, and we have the years across there. At the top, we have the caliphs, the different caliphs when they ruled, trying to fit them in, because some of them are very small, to try to squeeze them in. Only a few years, some of them are larger. It just gives us an idea. The Prophet Muhammad is at the first, and then we go through. This is the traditional account that's up there. What we've got underneath at the bottom are the different qiblas, but I've put a new line in there, and that new line is the definition or the words that are used in Islamic history. So a lot of people are familiar with the word Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah means the time of ignorance before the Prophet Muhammad revealed the Quran. So we have that. Then we read in Islamic history, we keep coming across this term Hanafiya. And Hanafiya, we have a whole chapter that works on this. Hanafiya is described as the religion of Abraham. And so there were Muslims there were Arabs during the time of Muhammad who went out trying to rebuild and reestablish the religion of Abraham. And I believe that's because in the middle of their city, which was Petra, and in the middle of that city was an altar that they believed was built by Abraham. And so they would face that altar and pray. And so people want to know, what is this religion of Abraham? And they tried to reestablish it. You can pull this out of Islamic writings. And so you can go back and read Ibn Hisham, Ibn Ishaq, and others. And the stories are there of these men who went out to establish that. Later on, when Muhammad was bringing his new teaching, people asked him, what is this new teaching? What are you bringing us? And he says, and this quote right from both the hadiths and the historians say, he said, I am bringing you the religion, I'm bringing you the Hanafiya. Okay, I'm bringing you the religion of Abraham. That is the term that is used all the way through the Rashidun and into the Umayyad times. There was always Hanafiya. This is why Islam as a term and as the name of the religion doesn't appear until later on in history. And the later writers then are really obsessed with trying to say Islam existed from the beginning. Everybody were Muslims. Even Adam was a Muslim. And so this whole thought of because they're trying they're rebranding this religion as Islam. And so you might say, why would they rebrand Hanafiya as Islam? So, Chad, what does Hanafiya stand for?
Hanafiya means to turn, or returning. So returning to the religion of Abraham, and it stands for taking this largely pagan Arab population and bringing them back to this monotheistic Abrahamic religion, which, as long as you're dealing with a pagan population, makes a lot of sense, and they were clearly quite successful. Once the religions you're brushing up against are mostly just Judaism and Christianity, and most of the pagans have been addressed, suddenly returning to the religion of Abraham doesn't carry quite the same stock it once did.
And you can imagine the Jews were very unhappy with returning to the religion of Abraham because they said, we're children of Abraham and we don't believe any of that stuff. And so it needed rebranding. And in the book, we go along, we start, and it's sort of a second theme running through the book because there is a man who is very influential. If you look at the timeline between Hanafi and Islam, it kind of blends. And if you look down below, you see all these qiblas. You see the reign of Hajjaj. And during the reign of Hajjaj, he's not a caliph. Hajjaj is the second to the caliph. He is in charge of the eastern half of the Islamic Empire through the lifetime of several caliphs. And he is the guy who keeps rebranding and changing Islam. There are some fascinating things that he does during this time. One of them is that he comes up with his own qibla, his own personal qibla, which he then has everybody in his half of the empire building mosques facing his qibla, which is the between qibla. And so he starts that, and that goes on for a while. When Hajjaj dies, the between qibla fades very quickly. I'm sure some were still in construction, and I'm sure some people built some later mosques, without measuring a qibla because there was an existing mosque there. They rebuilt it, and then it had the same direction. But it basically fades out very quickly within sort of 100 years or so. It's kind of gone. But Hajjaj, we keep coming back to him because he makes changes, and there are some shocking changes that he makes. What are some of the things you noticed?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, it's very difficult sometimes to find explicit manuscript evidence of what was going on during Hajjaj's reign. We know a number of things about him. We know he was a persecutor of the companions of Muhammad. That is clear in the histories. He is said to have killed 1 million men, whether that's an exaggeration or not.
Although the guy who said it said he personally sent over 100, and I think it's 110, it's over 100,000 people that he condemned to death that he had killed personally. And the rest of them were because of the wars or because of the influence that he had, that over 1 million men died during his reign.
Yeah, and Hajjaj is the general who settled the Second Islamic Civil War. He's the one who laid siege to the holy city, spilt blood in Masjid al-Haram. We believe this was in Petra at that time. Destroyed the Kaaba with trebuchets. He then led the pilgrimage that year in armor on a horse, which isn't the most pious thing to do. So it gives you a bit of a character personality, but we actually also have an historian who writes that the between Qibla, this Wasit Qibla, which is what Hajjaj built in his city, which he built, was amongst the misdeeds of Caliph Walid and his family. And Hajjaj had married into that family.
So there are other things that he did. Now, if you ask any Muslim, they will tell you that Hajjaj is the guy who added the vowel markings to the Quran. And so that is accepted by Muslims everywhere, except that when people have gone back, and now we're talking about not ourselves, but other people looking at the Quran, these are experts, that they find that Hajjaj did more than just add vowel markings, that he actually played with the meaning of words in the Quran. And there's some fascinating things that he did. Now, there's a chapter, there a section that we deal with looking at some of the German scholars, especially who looked at this because they believe the Quran was mostly Aramaic before it was voweled. When Hajjaj came along to vowel the Quran, there were Aramaic words that were old words that a lot of people didn't know anymore. The language had moved on. Arabic was developing. And so he actually put the vowels in a way that created words with different meanings. And we go to Ibn Abu Dawud. This is the son of Abu Dawud who writes the hadiths. He goes through and actually gives us examples of where Hajjaj actually changed the meaning of the Quran. And we look at other scholars as well. We look at what Christians were saying at the time, because Christians were looking and going, Hajjaj is changing their book, and so there's a lot of accusations that go on by Christians. Now, just before this, and if we take things in order, just before this, when the Muslims took over all of these cities, the Rashidun caliphs, they used the language of the time, which was Greek, and in some places even Latin was used, but Greek was more often used. And so the court records were always written in Greek, but many of the caliphs didn't speak or read Greek, and therefore, but that was the language that all governments used at the time. And so Hajjaj is one of the guys who came along, and he was over in Iraq, and there they wanted to do it there in Persian. And, here you've got people writing court records in Persian, and he doesn't speak Persian, and none of the Arabs speak Persian. And so he's insisting we got to make the language of Islam has got to be Arabic, and it's got to be the Arabic of the day. So he's one of the guys who spearhead this whole movement. He started at first saying, not Persian, we're going to write in Arabic. And then that influenced what happens in Damascus. And in Damascus, they start changing the language over. So he's already very involved in this language change, making everything Arabic. And so he then tackles the Quran and wants to make the Quran into good Arabic. And so he goes in and puts in not only the vowel marks, but actually changes some of the words slightly to have different meanings. This is all in Islamic history. You can go back and read this, and we have quotes where we go back and look that here is Hajjaj changing even the meaning of the words in the Quran at the time. He is leading the revisionists, okay? And he is one of those guys who's going around killing or silencing any traditionalists, even the companions of the Prophet. These guys he silences or puts to death during his lifetime. So completely silences the old stuff, and he rebrands Hanafiya, and he chooses a word where it says the religion you're following is to submit, and he uses that word and he rebrands it, and now Islam emerges. And so by the time we get later on to all these writers, they're completely convinced that Islam was the original religion that was preached and everything else. They understand Hanafiya was, the turning from being polytheists to being monotheists, but they don't catch that actually it was totally rebranded and remade. So the reason why I put this chart here, just so you recognize this, is that there are people today going back and looking at it, and they're telling us, and this is revisionist, and are saying Islam didn't exist before this time period. And in a way, they're right. But something did exist, and it is the original religion that was there. But even the companions of the prophet say, we no longer recognize the religion of Abraham. You have changed it so much. So this is the challenge. So this is more of what we're going to get into as you get into the book.
Definitely. And I was just wondering, given your hypothesis and your data, and I understand that we've got to separate these two things out as you have in this presentation. But given both the data and the hypothesis that you've tried to explain the data with, if someone was going to try to disprove your thesis, what would they need to do to succeed, in your opinion? Like, what would be the silver bullets plural or singular, that they would have to shoot at your thesis to kill it dead?
Dan's major critic, he's an expert in archaeoastronomy, Dr. David King. He's got two major criticisms of the work so far, which is probably a good place to start. His first one, and I'm majorly truncating this because he has written volumes and volumes and volumes on this. His first major objection is simply that he doesn't believe that the builders of these first mosques had the knowledge to be able to direct a mosque geographically, or place of prayer geographically, to a distant location. And this is pre-mathematics, and he just doesn't believe that that's possible. So he would then believe, he does admit, yes, these mosques seem to face Petra, but he would say that that's incidental, that they're trying to do something else. The problem with that is, to answer your question, is I'm not sure how you would prove that they didn't know how to do that when mathematically it appears that they did.
Well, the Arab armies were famous for navigating over the ocean of the desert, as it were.
Right. And the caravans,
why they constantly outsmarted the Romans. So they clearly knew something about navigating in the desert and finding their way around.
We fully agree, and we believe that it's actually the methods of desert navigation, which we detail in the book with the Indian Circle method, is perfectly capable of finding a distant Qibla, and we were quite happy to work through that. So I'm not sure that you could disprove Dan's thesis with that objection. And that's addressing the data more, but it gets a little blurry. The second part of that is Dr. King suggests that all of these mosques are aligned, but they're aligned in a number of different ways. Like Dan had mentioned, they may take the same orientation as a certain wall on the Kaaba and then say that they're aligned to the Kaaba. Or they may simply align to the solstice or to the cardinal directions. I think there's over a dozen different alignments that King has presented, and there may be more than that still. And the problem with then again is, how do you prove all of these different methods of alignment? You would have to find explicit manuscript evidence of each one, and the sources he uses are 1,000 years after the founding of Islam. They're not useful. So again, then it's nebulous how you're going to disprove that. I think one of the things that would really throw a spanner into the whole theory is if there were ever a serious archaeological dig done at Mecca, and if they ever finally uncovered that ancient trading city which was supposed to be there. We have nothing to indicate that ever existed. They are constantly destroying and paving over and digging out sites which are supposedly the historical sites around Mecca. And the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia have destroyed countless archaeological Muslim sites. And so I don't anticipate there will ever be a serious survey. And I don't anticipate there's anything to find there. But if they did...
So you guys agree that, which is a conclusion I've kind of come to, which is that Mecca in the 7th century was not the kind of city that is described in Islamic literature.
No, because we believe that what they're describing is actually the city of Petra, the first Mecca, and so and it fits all of those descriptions. So the later writers writing 300 years into Islamic history didn't realize that there had been a switch, and the city that Petra had been destroyed, the Black Rock had been moved to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and that became the second Mecca. And so when they're talking about Mecca, they're imagining it all took place in Saudi Arabia, rather than recognizing there was an original site.
Right. So I mean, I kind of get the feeling that Mecca in the 7th century was probably a couple of tents and maybe some kind of temple, like out in the desert, but it wasn't.
I don't think there was it
beyond a village.
There's no evidence there was a temple. All we have is that there was a well in the middle of a valley, and that people going through would stop and get water. And it's my belief that when they took the Black Rock in the middle of the Second Civil War, they took the rock and moved it as far away from Damascus as they could get it. They took it all the way down and to that valley where there was some water, and there they, for some reason, chose that place to hide it there. People moved with it, so a bunch of camels, horses, whatever. They moved down, women and children, out of the city during the middle of the war and put it there, probably thinking they would bring it back later. However, they lost the war, therefore it stayed there. And eventually people would go, oh, the Black Rock is over there. And so people would all start coming to see it. And so slowly this pilgrimage, and it wouldn't take very many years until people were going to see. Remember, these are pagans, many of them, and so they were coming to see the sacred stone that had showed up. And so eventually they had to, they were talking about, oh, if this is the sacred stone, then that's got to be Zamzam. And so suddenly they renamed the well, and then they renamed certain things, and suddenly little pilgrimage starts. And now the people are the people who had moved the rock down, they're now selling goods and food and water and suddenly we have a pilgrimage beginning. And so it's not until 78 after the Hijra that we get an idea that they actually rebuild Masjid al-Haram, and the Kaaba and everything is actually built there. And we have an inscription that actually dates that in Mecca and Saudi Arabia.
So you can imagine then al-Hajjaj's ascendant. He's accumulated vast amounts of power, in part because of settling the civil war and causing this chaos, or having his part in it. And now he's establishing his mosque in his great city, and he has to choose a Qibla. And he can either choose the city he just besieged and destroyed, or he can choose these tents in the desert with a crowd of pilgrims. And he doesn't choose either. He points his mosques in between, and then subsequently, geographically in the timeline, the mosques in his territory adopt this between position, and we call that the time of confusion.
Interesting. I mean, have you guys ever heard of the Roman Emperor Elagabalus? He was an Arab. He was one of the few Arab Roman emperors, and he's famous for introducing a rock god, a black rock god, to the Roman Empire. And apparently the Arabs used to worship this black rock, and he brought it into the Roman Empire. And I think, that black rock, I think, ended up in Damascus. But I do find it quite coincidental that centuries before Islam, we have evidence of Arabs worshipping a black rock. And
much later. Go ahead.
No, and that Islam is a religion in which Arabs have a black rock as being very central to their religiosity. There seems to be like a continuity from ancient Roman times into Islam through Arab culture of rock worship, but that's maybe a slightly off topic.
Yeah, my understanding,
because you mentioned Damascus and the moving of the Black Rock.
My understanding is that the Black Rock was probably a comet or meteorite that had struck, and it's reasonably large. It's probably 2 feet across. I mean, so it left a huge crater, and there's a huge crater out in southern Jordan where it may have landed. And so, I mean, would understand that people found this rock, and it did all this destruction, had all this power, and therefore it became an object of veneration. And I have no problem with that. And I've read about the Romans, but there are other black comet things that people had found as well. I mean, anything that came screaming out of the sky in massive power and hit the ground and destroyed all kinds of things. People went in and found it and like, this has got power, you know, and so it would become a focus of prayer. So there may have been several black rocks as well.
Maybe you're familiar with this, but in the Byzantine Pseudo-Lexicon, which is a later document, there's an entry on that describes the Arabs as worshiping a black idol, a black rock, and they connect that idol with Dushara, who was a primary deity in Nabatea with the Petra as its capital. And there's tomb inscriptions that also confirm some of these connections. So it's very interesting that there seems to also be this black rock worship in the Petra area, which would exactly line up with what we believe.
And if you follow that along, Dushara was the title, meaning the one of the Shara Mountains. Du meaning one, and Shara meaning that's the name of the mountains. That's the title of this god. We found there are inscriptions, and the archaeologists and historians point this out, in Saudi Arabia, down in Madat and Salah, who put Dushara's name together with Hubble. Hubble is the name of the god. Dushara is the title. And so when we read about the god Hubble, who the early Muslims worshipped, that is Dushara. We can put that together in inscriptions. If we back up to Petra, we have Dushara's temple right in the middle of Petra, and then we have this altar to Abraham right in front of Dushara's temple. So is the Dushara's temple facing that altar, or is the altar in front of the... Anyway, it's just as it is described by Ibn Hisham and others, that's the temple of Dushara was right beside the original Kaaba. We also go into where is the original Kaaba in Petra, and we look at it. We look at the measurements and the descriptions and the measurements that are there, and what are described by Zuraki of the first mosque, the first Kaaba as it was built during the time of Muhammad, and he gives the measurements of the four sides, because it was not a square. It had four separate sides, and that's exactly that structure standing in front of Dushara's temple. It's the measurements fit.
In Petra to this day. When I came board on the project, I needed editing work. I was a friendly skeptic, but you're looking at Azraki's measurements. It exactly suits what's standing in Mecca today, and it suits this.
In Mecca or Petra?
No, in Mecca. That one is accurate as well. And it also suits this altar, this ruined altar standing in front of a massive temple in Petra. And you go, it's four irregular walls. How is this accidental? You know, my skepticism sort of melted.
And everything's there. That's where you find the catapult stones that were used to use catapults against it and so forth. And all in Petra, all of the bits and pieces are all there. So
the catapult stones are described in the Islamic literature as
Hajjaj
Mecca.
Yeah, when Hajjaj was attacking Mecca. Yeah,
interesting. That's really interesting.
And
I want to try. Go on, Dan.
No, there's lots more things in the Islamic record. It talks about during that battle that the guys in Mecca retreated to a building close to the Kaaba, and that's where they fought from. I was in Petra during the time Brown University was excavating what they called the Great Temple. I don't think it's a temple, but that was the name they gave it early on, but it's a big, huge structure. And one of the guys there was taking me around, showing me the excavation. And he said, in the doorways, we can see where they have filled in the doorways up to, about neck level, so they could fire things over it. Like they defended this building when it was in ruins. And so at some time, he said, we don't know when, there was a battle here, and they were defending themselves. And stones throw away, there are catapult stones laying on the ground, and I'm like, it all fits. It's exactly what it was. It was the setting in Petra has got everything that needs to be there as described by the earliest historians.
So to be clear to those that may have missed it, what your thesis is essentially saying is that Petra was once known as Mecca, but at a certain time in Islamic history, probably Hajjaj, yes?
No.
That Mecca came to refer to what we now know as Mecca, and later Islamic writers who created the classical Islamic narrative, they were not aware of the shift of what Mecca referred to. And so they took all this history that was actually connected to Petra and just thought that it meant Mecca as we know it.
That's correct.
Am I getting that right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. In that case, then, I've got a very simple question for you. Who do you think Muhammad was? Who is Muhammad?
Well, see, now we're looking back what Islam says Muhammad was and trying to get behind that to the Hanafiya, this time when they were trying to convert the pagans into following one God. And so we have only the words of the revisionists who are telling us. We don't have the words of the traditionalists. Okay, the revisionists won the war. Okay, so the revisionists started by Hajjaj, and then all the guys who followed all the way up to all the writings we have. So we have a problem that we don't have any eyewitnesses. We don't have any records. We have no written witnesses. We have only post-Hajjaj writings. So that gives us a difficulty. But we can try to look through that lens, or all those lenses that are there, to try to figure out. So I would say that there was, I believe, a man in the city of Petra whose name was Muhammad, or most places call him Muhammad. And I would think his name morphed into Muhammad because he is the praised one is a name. But, the name Muhammad existed before the Muhammad we have. So with Abraham the elephant, there was a Muhammad who came along this. And so we're going back, previous years. So Muhammad was a name that was used. But the Christians all call him Muhammad. So, we don't even know exactly what his name is. But here's a man who during the rebuilding of that Kaaba was chosen by chance, by lot, to put the black rock in its place. And so he believed God had chosen him for a special purpose. He was a guy who had a rich wife, and so he didn't have to work very hard. He spent a lot of time and thought and contemplation. And during that time in a cave, and I think I can take you to the cave in Petra where he was, but in that time period, somehow he had some sort of special revelation. Now, there's all kinds of questions about him. Did he have epilepsy? Was that one of the things that happened? Or was this a satanic thing? Or was it a combination of things? We don't know, but he became convinced at that point that he was being bothered by the jinn, that he was demon possessed, that he was, some sort of satanic thing. He was going crazy. He uses the word Majnun, is written there. And so it wasn't until other people convinced him he wasn't going crazy, he began to take this seriously and recognize that these were revelations that were coming to him. And he began to tell people, I'm getting revelations by the angel Gabriel. And so he then started teaching. I think he really existed. I think he went around telling people that he was getting revelations and they were getting written down, and that a small group of people, and this is where I disagree with a lot of the traditional account that people today think he immediately had this huge following. He had a very small following. And when we find the very first mosques, they're very small mosques. They're not very big. And even over the first 80 years, 100 years into Islam, there's still mosques, very small mosques being built. They don't build these massive mosques till much later, and especially in the Abbasid time. Now we're getting into the big mosques, but the Umayyads build a few, but not that many. So, this guy was around, and so he influenced people about his new religion, which he calls Hanafiya. And people went around trying to convert the pagans into worshiping one God and following the religion of Abraham. And I think that's where it is until he died. I think the people after him created a lot of story about him to make him into something bigger and better than he was.
I'll ask you a follow-up then, Dan. Do you think he changed when he had to flee to Medina?
Yes, I do think that it started out as a guy simply preaching this message, turn to one God. I think the Christians were probably quite happy with them, his Jewish relatives, because through his mother's side are the Jews that were living in Medina. They were quite happy with him preaching, return to the religion of Abraham, and there's only one God. I mean, what's wrong with that? I mean, if you're from a Jewish or Christian background, it's like, oh, this guy's got an angle here. He's talking to these people. In Medina, the whole thing became political. And suddenly, with politics comes military and power, and the whole thing changed. And we see that in writing. I look at it that way. So I'm not a revisionist, as there are many people today. I don't deny that these things happen. I see mosques that are built by the different people during this Rashidun and Umayyad era. I don't think there was a vacuum there at all, but I think it was called Hanafiya. I think it was Hajjaj who created for us the Muhammad that we know today. He raised him up. He made Muhammad into the great prophet, and he formulated the religion of Islam. The prayers came from this time that we have today. The pilgrimage that we have today in Mecca, all of this stuff was created later. It's not what was there during the Hanafiya.
Do you believe that Muhammad eventually conquered the Arabian Peninsula?
No, that was after he died that the conquering of the Arabian Peninsula happened. Abu Bakr. And
okay, so you don't believe that Muhammad united the Arab tribes, or
not particularly, not the way I read history. I mean that
so when it talks about Muhammad conquering Mecca, do you understand that to be Muhammad conquering Petra?
Yeah, I'll speak.
Yeah,
to that
let's
for a
go
second.
back, because one of the chapters Chad did when we got to it was writing about how does this fit into Roman history, the Byzantine history, and
This
Chad Chad, whose background and his hobby or whatever is Roman history, he said, I'd like to take this. And I said, well, I've collected all the books. Here's what I've got. You read them. You do this chapter. And so I was like, good. That's not out of my area. And so, Chad, what did you find?
Yeah, this whole idea, if Mecca as we knew it was Petra, and that is where the genesis of all this took place, then how in the world does Muhammad come with his army and conquer Petra if it's part of the Roman Empire? And Dan has faced this question numerous times. And actually, as we did the work and unpacked this, it was really exciting what we found, the way the timeline works. I went after this question in a number of different ways. I won't speak to all of them at length because there's one that really matters. One of them I looked at, though, was what were the Roman fortifications like in Arabia, northern Arabia at that time. And what I found through Mariana Castro did some fantastic research on that, is that they were quite porous. They were more for tracking people. They were made up of largely signal posts. It wasn't fortifications on the Rhine River like we imagine it. Then who was a Roman soldier on that front? Most of the garrisons were entirely Arabs. Many of the patrols were by Confederate Ghassanid Arabs. So by and large, if you met a Roman soldier in northern Arabia in the Roman Empire, they would be an Arab. And so that's another. They weren't the red capes and plumed helmets of Holy Rome, And these would be tribes that had become Christian. Right. The Ghassanids were largely Christians, and so, but you would have all sorts of different people with the local garrisons. I looked at the religious question, because if the Quraysh and their worship was going on in the Roman Empire, how were they doing this pagan worship at the Kaaba when numerous times emperors had decreed that pagan worship was forbidden? Well, the answer is already in the way I phrased that. They had to decree that numerous times. And I did a study of the existence of pagan worship. In similar times, I did 5th, 6th century. There wasn't a lot of stuff from the 7th century I could look at because of the way the borders had shifted. But even as late as the 6th century, immediately outside Constantinople, there were tens of thousands of pagans still worshiping. And we have that from church records. They would celebrate these missionaries who converted 30,000 people in Anatolia in the heart of the empire. And that tells us there were 30,000 people to convert in Anatolia. And there were records all across Egypt and Syria of pagan worship in the open continuing. So I think
that's means country folk.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. But sorry, I wasn't clear, Chad. Did Muhammad conquer Petra?
Yes. Yeah. So he did.
He did. Right. Okay. So that go on.
Yeah. The context to that is the Sassanid war with the Byzantine Empire. We have a timeline in the book where the major developments in Islam from Medina, Muhammad starting his ministry, exactly lines up to the goings on in the Roman Empire and their misfortunes with the Sassanid War. And in fact, the Quran very rarely makes explicit historical references, but it does reference this event because they were a part of the Roman Empire. They were directly impacted by the Romans losing the war against the Sassanids. The Muslims identified with the Christians as people of the book, and the Quraysh identified with the Sassanids as fellow pagans, and so they chose sides. And when the Sassanids were ascendant, all Roman political authority, when Jerusalem fell, east of the Jordan, fell to pieces. And the Quraysh were ascendant once again, and that's how we get the whole narrative of the Quran that we have with this power struggle between the two and their early histories. And so Muhammad flees to Medina. He becomes a political power by building this military force. And one of the first battles he fights, or one of the most interesting, is the Battle of Mu'tah. And I was reading Byzantine historians who are struggling with the question, why is Muhammad sending his very limited army up east of the Jordan to fight with the Byzantines? And from the Quran, doesn't Muhammad identify with the Byzantines? But that was a period of time after the Byzantines had defeated the Sassanids, where the Byzantines were working to reestablish their authority east of the Jordan River, and they hadn't done it yet. Muhammad was moving to challenge them because he wanted to seize the holy city for himself. When he lost the Battle of Mu'tah quite badly, he immediately, in months later, took the city. And that's why what I see is going on there. He took the city from the Quraysh before the Byzantines were able to reestablish their authority. And the later emperor, or maybe it was Heraclius, he set his border north of Petra. And so they ended up not being challenged by the Byzantines as they were rebuilding their empire.
Because Heraclius had obviously just fought a massive war against the Persians and was pretty exhausted in terms of his military efforts. Yeah.
Right. And when you look at Mu'tah, it's very interesting. The historical records, why is there a Quraysh man going to the Romans to inform that Muhammad is sending a raid against them if the locality of all this is supposed to be deeper in Arabia? This all sounds like it's happening in northern Arabia in the former Roman Empire. Are you talking about
Sahih al-Bukhari, Book 1, Hadith 8? I think it is.
It could be. I don't have the reference in front of me.
Where there's this discourse between Heraclius and some envoy speaking about Muhammad.
Oh no, there's a Byzantine record which says that they received. There was an informant from the Quraysh who came in, and it wasn't the great battle. In the Islamic records, there's 120,000 Ghassanids and 120,000 Greeks, and it's crazy. For the Byzantines, they were just stopping an Arab raid and give them a bloody nose. But Muhammad was trying to oppose them with what he had.
Yeah, I've got you. I understand. So let me just try and regather some of my thoughts, because I was listening to all of that and I was writing down. I mean, when you read the Quran, there seems to be like this almost contradictory narrative inside the Quran, which is this idea that Islam, and it mentions Islam, is the religion of Allah, and then you've also got talk of the religion of Abraham, but you've also got this contradictory almost discourse towards the people of the book. On the one hand, it says that Islam is the religion that Allah wants you to follow. But then on the other hand, it says that, everyone's been given the revelation. we're all in a race and we've got to compete with one another in virtue. As we all race towards Allah, Jews, Christians, and I think even Zoroastrians get a mention in that, but maybe I'm making that bit up. Do you believe that therefore the Quran was written by Muhammad, or that it was like a nucleus Quran was written that was then revised later by Al-Hajjaj, or that Hajjaj just wrote the Quran? Like,
I'll jump in.
Or some other theory.
Yeah,
it's a good question.
Hajjaj had something to work with. He didn't write the Quran. I don't think he was anywhere close, and nobody accuses him. They accuse him of changing the Quran, so it pre-existed him. My take on it, and this is now my personal take, is that Muhammad gathered the Quran, that he put together bits and pieces. Some of it were his own revelations that he received. Some of it were things that were going on and happening in the church. There are times when he's like, "Oh, that's good. Write it down. Write it in the book," you know. And so he's collecting things together. So it's a hodgepodge of things. That's why they could take and make it the longest surahs to the shortest surahs, because it wasn't in chronological order. And even when you read through the surahs, there are breaks in some of them. Like Surah chapter 2 is a hodgepodge, I mean, of just everything put together. And where does this topic end and a new topic begin? And so they're just writing down. I mean, he was recording and making a book for his people, because his people were the people without a book. And so he's the prophet, so he's got to bring a book. So he's putting things together, not necessarily, that's the way I view it. And so it's not necessarily in chronological order. Some of the things are personal things that he dreamed up either in his sleep or very conveniently, putting into the Quran. And some of it are things that he's probably picked up from the churches. Now, if you put this story of the beginning of the Quran into Petra, then you need to recognize there were several churches in Petra, competing theologies going on in that city. Even though the Christians in that city probably were only a quarter of the population of the city. If you look at it physically today, the Christian churches are all in one quarter, all in one section of it. So, I mean, he's there. There's this confrontation of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and he's trying to reestablish the religion of Abraham. And so helping him in his understanding of Abraham is the traditions that the people had there. Abraham did this and Abraham said that. So he's quickly gathering those things up to create his pilgrimage and the way Abraham worshiped. Abraham walked around the altar at one point. So guess what? We're all going to walk around the altar. I mean, these are the things he's putting together. But he's also got the Jews telling him things, and he's also got Christians telling him things. So it's a mishmash of all kinds of stuff put together into one book. He has, when he talks about Allah, if you look at it carefully, the way he describes Allah is the way he would describe the pantheon of Nabatean gods. If you look at the pantheon of Nabatean gods, they correspond exactly with the characteristics of Allah. If you, and I've got a chart that compares these two together, and not in this book.
Are you talking about the 99 attributes there?
No, I'm just talking about the attributes of God. Yeah, you could use the 99, and don't do that. But like Dushar is the god of war. You have a god of Al-Qutbi is the god of writing, and writing, it can be sacred. I mean, you've got the different gods and goddesses that existed in the Nabatean pantheon. You have Manat, which is the goddess of fate. When you throw the dice, fate is cast, and so you've got Al-Qutbi, it is written, and you've got the goddess of fate. When you put those things all together, that's how he saw the one God. It was through the eyes of the pantheon of gods in the Nabatean setting. That all fits together. And so he is not describing to us God of the Bible. He's not even interested in the God of the Bible. He is bringing the God of the Nabatean people and explaining it. And so people who follow Al-Dushara would go, oh yeah, that's just like Al-Dushara. Somebody else will go, that's just like Al-Qutbi, that, writing is sacred. And somebody else would say, oh yeah, fate, it is written, and, and it's all, all of these things he's describing, people would agree with and could come together. I think that's why he very quickly went out and conquered and his followers conquered among the pagans of the day, is they recognized in his description of the one God the powers of all the other gods. And so he went, and that's why as a Christian today, I look at this and I go, I don't recognize this God that Muhammad is describing. And Jews would look at it and say, we don't recognize this God as the God that Muhammad, in the very same way as I would go down to the university here in my city and talk to people about who is God. And they've got some crazy ideas out there about who is God. The problem isn't the word that's used for God or anything else. It's just that people don't understand who God is, the characteristics of God as he revealed himself. And so Muhammad didn't have all of these prophets. The whole idea of all these prophets were Muslims, that came, I believe, later on. I think Hajjaj kind of worked that whole thing into there because he's trying to get Christians and Jews to agree with Islam. But from the beginning, Muhammad is preaching to these pagans, and he is making the religion of Islam to fit them so that they will join and become the Hanafiya. That's what his focus is. Once you get Hanafiya in your head, then a lot of early Islam starts to make sense.
I mean, I myself have often thought that there was something before what we think of as Islam. I've never been able to give it a title. I just called it proto-Islam, but I think Hanafiya might be a better way to describe it. So moving on and just sort of focusing a little bit on you, what has this intellectual journey cost you personally? And why have you decided to put it down after such a huge in personal investment?
Well, you're talking to me, I guess. I'm the guy who gets all excited about something, jumps on the bandwagon, works it to death, and then saying, okay, I've come this far, now you take it on. And I've done that with numerous projects, saying, okay, I've gotten this far. I don't want to spend the rest of my life, this is the thing I do, because this is not the thing I do. It's something I have been doing, but it's not who I am. And so, I mean, I remember, I just give you an example, years and years and years ago, I was at a conference. It was a marriage seminar kind of thing. And they introduced the guy, Gary Chapman, who had just written the book, The 5 Love Languages. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I didn't think much of it till years later. He's still going around teaching the 5 love languages. And 20 years later, that's what he's known about. That's what he does. That's all. And I'm just like, I couldn't do that. I'm not a teacher. I hate having to teach the same thing over and over and over again to a new set of students. That's like, no, I want to get out and research. I want to get out and dig. I want to do things. And I'm very happy to completely change my topic. My original topic was studying worldview and understanding cultures and things like that. I did that for a long time, and then I moved on, and then I picked this topic up, and in my mind, it's time to lay this down. Now is a time for the guys who really want to dig into this, the archaeologists, the historians, the Islamic specialists. Take this Qibla data, look at what we've done, how we fit these things together, and you guys work on it. Okay, I've come far enough, and I am now 68 coming up, and it's time to just sort of back away. I want to put an end to this. Here's the book. Here's the video. Maybe do another film, to try to explain all of this, and then I want to walk away and close that chapter in my life and move on to other things.
And did this come with any personal cost to you? Have you suffered anything? Because like anything that criticizes Islam prickles the feathers of certain let's say, less than noble individuals. And, for you to be basically saying, look at what the rocks say, they don't agree with the books. Like for anyone who can follow the argument, you are essentially just pointing out that Islamic history is wrong. So has there been any kind of pushback in that regard, or have you
Actually not, and mostly because I put it down to mostly because we're working with empirical data. And I mean, people are going, oh, yeah, this is crazy. But then they go look at the Qibla tool, they look at the maps, they look at stuff and going, oh, how do you explain this? And so that has helped a lot. Also, I am not that far off of what I would call where the traditionalists were, at least understanding what happened. I'm not denying that there is a prophet Muhammad. I'm not saying, he didn't exist. I'm not saying the Rashidun caliphs didn't exist or things like that. I think they did exist. I think the rocks will support some of that. Not this particular story that Muhammad is a prophet of God. I don't think he was a prophet of God. I think he was an opportunist who grabbed the opportunities that came to him. And I suspect that maybe he was mentally challenged in some ways in his life, if I can dare say that, perhaps through having epilepsy or other things, as I read and it's described. And I don't think he was perfect in any way. I look at his moral life and I have all kinds of questions. So I don't see an example that I would want to follow as I would in someone like Jesus Christ, who I see an example of, here's somebody I want to follow. Here's somebody whose teachings I trust. And here's somebody whose life I would give my life to follow after. I don't see that in the person of Muhammad. So, but I have not been threatened in any way. I have not been challenged in any way, but I have poured my life into it. I have given 20 years of my life. I have given my finances, everything that I have poured into this. And it's my health is gone. I mean, when you start spending 10, 15 hours a day and don't take holidays and do that for 15 years, you wear out, and I'm worn out. I poured 100% of what I can into this. It's time now to back away and have a break and move on.
That is totally understandable. If you could go back all the way to the beginning 20 years ago, and you could do this entire project over again, knowing what you know at the end, what would you do differently?
If I knew what I knew at the end,
yeah.
Oh,
what would you do differently?
If I could read the book ahead of time. So if I could read the book ahead of time, that would be different, because then I think I would go hunting, because then I would have had time to really do more academic work and to either get some degrees in this area myself, although some of these areas there are no degrees. You can't go get a PhD in Qibla studies. I mean, it just, it's not like you can go out and do that without going to Dr. King and getting his particular take on it. But I mean, generally, I would have looked for scholars who would work on each of these small areas. The problem scholars have said to me is they have said, this whole thing is so wide, what you're presenting. And they would say, I am a scholar, I can address this little area. But they're addressing that little area in their understanding of the traditional Islamic account. So if somebody comes along and says, what about this? You would say immediately, oh, I can't agree with that, because they don't have the big picture. So the challenge is, how do you get more people to see the big picture earlier on? And that's still our challenge. I still talk to Chad sometimes, say, Chad, how do we explain this? How can we explain this in 90 minutes to an audience? All of this stuff. How do we put together like 20 years of research? And in all of these areas, the breadth of it is so big. How do you explain that in 90 minutes? I still don't know how to do that. we've done pretty well the 90 minutes, almost 2 hours now. And you're starting to catch on to what's in the book.
But I think, you say maybe if you could go back those 20 years, you might get all the degrees and everything. But for exactly what you just described, I don't think any of this would have been possible if you had done that.
Yeah.
Because one of the audacious things about the book, and one of the reasons it was so fun to work on and edit, is that we take on every topic we think might be relevant. And we are not experts in all of these fields by a long shot, but we think it helps fill out the picture. So we try. And if we were both PhDs, we would never stake our reputations on that. Since we're free to actually try to present the big picture. And I think that's valuable.
Yeah, I have nothing to lose by doing this.
Let me ask the question another way.
Can we close the
yeah, do you want to bring the
we're there we go.
There we go.
All right.
Now
hey.
Can see
there
how
you are.
out of focus I am. Let's ask the question another way. Say someone who's 20 years old is watching this and they think, all right, I want to take the next step from what you have done. How would you imagine the next steps of pursuing this kind of research and investigating this particular thesis to look like? What would be the next steps to either expose the thesis as fundamentally flawed or to establish the thesis as absolute undeniable a part of world history? What would be the next steps for the next Dan Gibson and Chad unknown surname?
That's a little hard to do. It depends if you're doing this academically. Is that what you want to do? Or if you're doing this as just a personal study. I mean, all these areas need more investigation. The Hanafiya is something we have brought up and proposed. We think it fits. But somebody could take that and say, I'm going to do a complete study on this, really dig it all out and put it all together with Petra setting in mind. And how does it fit where the stones are? That's a whole area. I mean, many of the chapters in the book, whole what do you call it? The word is gone from me. The scholars have spent their lives working on some of these areas, like the Aramaic to the Arabic shift of the Quran, which we believe Hajjaj was responsible for in making that shift. People have invested their entire careers on that one little step, and so all of these things can be investigated, but we'd like to see them investigated with the stones in mind, not just removed from that, putting it into the context of the stone. So we can go back and look at all of Islamic history again, and it can all be re-examined in the light of what are the stones telling us.
So you would filter Islamic textual history through the archaeological history.
I think that needs to be done, and I think the archaeology has to come first, and then the textual later, as we would do in any other archaeological setting. Is you look at what happened in the archaeological setting, and then you try to figure out what other people said they thought happened, especially if they wrote 200 years later.
Are there any particular chapters of the new book that you're particularly proud of, that you sort of finished that chapter and you went, wow, I really did well there?
No, because I want to rework that chapter on the religion of Abraham. Well, the problem is that you keep coming up with new stuff that you're seeing. I mean, what you're talking about here now is trying to interpret the data. The first couple chapters about the data, that's there. That stands. We're not arguing with that. And it can only be expanded further as more mosques come into being or more excavations are done. So that is set. It's how does it fit into the Islamic story, and how do you fit all that together? That's where more work can be done. And so everything we've written, boy, you get done and then you find out more stuff. It's just, I mean, I like his chapter on the Romans. I think it's brilliant. It ends up with a chart. What's happening in Roman history? What's happening in Islamic history? How come nobody's done this? I mean,
Yeah.
before. I mean, there's a lot of things like that. We would just look at each other and go, how come no archaeologists measured their Qibla direction? Like almost none of them. And we go look at all of these charts. And guys like Cresswell, who went out and visited all these mosques, even 1960s, 1970s, and he didn't measure a single Qibla direction.
Yeah, we have some of his sketches here. He has beautiful, elaborate floor plans of these mosques. No indication of what direction they're facing. Nothing. It's mind-boggling.
I am just bear with us. Just need to do something. As I say, I've had IT issues and my computer is feeling very delicate. So
yeah, don't offend it.
Yes, I'm being very gentle, very gentle with it. Anyway, so I think like it'd be a good opportunity now maybe to try and get some of the audience to ask some questions. Would you be happy to take some questions from the audience?
Sure. Not that we know the answers. Yeah. We'll give it a stab.
That is fine. And obviously you can, if you don't know an answer, you don't know an answer. So what I'm going to ask, guys, is please do ask on topic questions. I'm going to be filtering very heavily. And anyone who's not asking a question on topic, I am going to ignore you. So please put @Bob so that I can see that you're asking the question to me. And we will then, and please don't put @Bob and then stick a comment on that's not a question, right? So I'm looking for questions for Dan. My experience of doing this, and this is one of the reasons why I don't do it very much, is because I'll ask for a question on topic and then someone will just ask me a random question that's got nothing to do with the thing that I've just spent an hour and a half talking about. So if that tends to be the way it goes, we'll just stop with the audience questions, because I have the most disobedient live stream audience you could possibly imagine. So I think we've got one question so far that's on topic. So did Dan ever consider Yaman instead of Petra?
Okay, that's an excellent question, because there have been books written that saying the Old Testament narrative took place in the Yemen rather than in where we traditionally put it. And the answer is I've read some of that material. I have been in Yemen. I spent 3.5, almost 4 years in Yemen, traveling around, going to to many different places. And no, I do not see the narrative fitting Yemen at all. The only place I see Yemen fitting in to the biblical narrative is back in the story of Job, and also in the story of Solomon and Bathsheba and so forth. That I've covered in the book Quranic Geography, especially about the story of Job. But I don't see the Yemen thing. The tribes in Yemen don't have the oral history that you would find, say, up in Jordan as well. Sitting down, I've been out with tribes, sat down, traveled all through the country, talking to people. I personally don't see the Yemen story as being able to fit. And I think the people who put that together got this idea, went out and tried to throw things together. I don't think it's well defended. I don't think it's been well accepted. I don't know of any real academics that have accepted the Yemen argument. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
I understood it. I don't know if the person that asked the question did, but I understood what you were saying. Okay, let's have a look. Have we got another question on topic? Bear with us. So this question looks like someone might be taking up the invitation to try and continue the work that you've started, but he's curious about where to even sort of point his horse, as it were. What career would this be called? Would I go into general historical studies at university? So I guess he's wondering about if he wanted to study this further, what kind of academic course would you be looking at to get the necessary skills and to touch on the topic?
You would want to study Islamic studies. That's very general when you start out, and what you will be studying is whatever the school and whatever the professor in that school presents as Islamic studies. So be aware that every university has a different take. So I have a friend, some good friends who went to McGill University in Canada to do their Islamic degrees. And whenever they get up and say something, other Muslims will go, you studied at McGill, that doesn't count. You don't count because that's not an Islamic school. So, I mean, pick your university very carefully. Be aware that they all have certain bias and they all have certain teachers. As I've gone through this, the first question I get asked is, where did you study? Who did you study under? Because people want to know that so they can put me in that box. And they're going, oh, you are a student of that university, of that scholar, therefore you must believe this. And I am not a student of a university or didn't sit under any particular teacher and absorb their viewpoint. And therefore, I'd really have tried to let the stone speak and go back and look at them without coming with some preconceived idea that I was picked up in university. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it certainly does.
I mean, many times you go and study and Chad has told me about being in digs and talking with people, and they're like, oh, there's a mosque. Oh yeah, that just must face Jerusalem. They have never thought it through. So you might be studying, under some respected teacher, but they've never even looked at this. Most of academia has not looked at this. What's in the book is not accepted by standard academia that's out there. That's why the title is just, please let the stone speak.
Yeah, there is a weariness in academia, I think, to openly be too critical of Islamic narratives, because I think people have been intimidated, is my personal opinion on that one. Another question here. Bart asks, is Dan available to do public talks and tours, even if he's still not developing the field? So would you still be willing to do a talk on this topic, even though you're putting it down?
Possibly. I have done talks all over the place. I have spoken on every continent in the world except Antarctica. I haven't found any penguins that are interested in the topics that I've done. Mostly I've been talking about Islamic culture and worldview and, this type of thing. As far as this history goes, though, how do you present what we found in this book and talk about it in 1 hour or 2 hours? It's very difficult. We have touched on only a couple of chapters in the book. We haven't, dug in exclusively. There's a lot of stuff in the book. I just say, please read the book. I mean, early on, I remember writing a book years ago, and somebody, when I said, can you come talk on this? And I'm like, have you read the book? And they're like, no, we heard about it. I said, go read the book. Like, the reason I wrote the book is so I don't have to talk on this topic. It's like, here's the book. I recognize that, I guess, when I'm talking off the cuff, I'm not nearly as good as a book that we worked through the wording, and Chad came along and worked through the wording to get it to say it right. Not to say too much, not to say too little, to try to get that balance. So that's why the book is coming out. Read the book.
So you personally feel you're a better writer than you are a speaker?
I would think so, yes. Yeah. Because I have a lot of mental blocks. I'm tired. I don't remember stuff. I can't quote things. You ask, what about this or what about that? Some days I can't even remember what's in some of the chapters in the book, simply because I'm tired and I need a break. Okay. I haven't had a holiday in years. So that's why the book is there.
Go and have a nice holiday. Maybe people in the audience could suggest holiday destinations.
I wouldn't know what to do on a holiday.
Go to Antarctica.
Probably start writing another book.
I would love to go to Antarctica. Then I could tick the last one off.
Yeah. So another question. So apart from Dr. King, are there any other credible critics of your work? I think that's a very good question.
That is a great question. Dan has been mentioned offhand in a lot of different works, because I think especially his early Islamic Qiblas, his second book, got quite a broad reading, and that's when the academic world really started to pick up on you. Maybe it was a little bit before that as well. But the reason, like I had written the whole chapter on Dr. King. I told Dan, I'll write it. You don't have to worry about that. So I wrote a chapter on it.
Which means that he read all of Dr. King's papers and stuff.
Well, not all of them.
But a lot of them, up to that point. Then he's writing the chapter.
So I wrote the chapter, and then I'm done with it. I'm happy with it finally, I think. And then he releases a monograph that's over 1,200 words long. I did a Control F.
1,200 pages.
1,200 pages. I did a Control F and put in Dan Gibson to see how often Dan was mentioned, and it's over 1,700 times. And I had to read that thing. And one of the problems with this is exactly as we've said, nobody measures Qiblas except two guys. One of them is a PhD with this great history in archaeoastronomy, who has decided a long time ago he knew exactly what was going on and has never been challenged. And the other guy is Dan. And so we have these two fish in the pond, and nobody else is doing this work. Like Dan has done the work. The database is there. Go write papers on this. But so far that hasn't happened. Criticize him if you want to. Like we think the data stands up, but people just have to do the work.
And one of the issues is Dr. King was really attacked me, and sort of I don't know if anger is the right word, but
it was ad hominem.
You're right. And so he attacked me. He attacked the data. He attacked everything I said. And I think he scared off a lot of people going, boy, I don't want to do this, because if I get attacked by somebody else, then the fear of that's going to come back on their career. And see, I don't have a career in this, so my career is not in danger at all. So I can tackle this without fear, and I don't mind we learned a lot. Both Chad and I have learned a lot from what Dr. King has said. There's some things that he was actually very good on. There's some good criticisms that we took in mind as we worked through the book and needed to address. But there's a lot of stuff there that just sometimes, what is he saying? What is going on here? Where is he at? And in the end, I'll just say this briefly. In the end, I came up with, I thought, well, what happens if we take this theologically? And theologically, Dr. King is telling us that God asked Muhammad to pray in the direction of the Masjid al-Haram, which is the word that he uses, doesn't say Mecca. And so they had to face in that direction when they pray. However, Muslims didn't know how to do that. They didn't know how to do that for 300 years. So God asked them to do something they hadn't a clue how to do, and it took them 300 years to figure out that they needed to use mathematics so they could do it correctly. That is Dr. King's basic thing, is God asked Muslims to do something they couldn't do. And so they did their best, and they ended up praying all over in all kinds of directions. And guys, God either accepted that the direction of prayer doesn't really matter, or all those early people are not going to be in paradise because they were disobeying God by not praying towards Masjid al-Haram in Mecca.
It is a debate I would love to have, but I know you don't like to debate. I would love to maybe Chad would like to be your champion, like in the medieval period where the princess chooses her knight and then the knight duels on behalf of the princess. Like, sorry, you're the princess in this one, Dan. But
I'll debate you on grammar any day.
Fair enough. So,
he's really good at commas.
That's it. It stops there.
So, you guys, it's been wonderful to have you on, and thank you so much for your time. Just before you go, Dan and Chad, who would you recommend that I have on my channel to do a live stream? Have you got anyone that you really respect who you think I should have on my channel as doing a live stream on this or any other topic that you've come across that you find really interesting?
We look at each other like, I don't know.
Just like
We're-
no one. It's just me.
No, it's
How
like
do you improve? How do you improve?
it's like we're at the bottom of a well, and just the two of us are down here. And it's like, are there other people out there? For the last year, we've been working on this book and just talking to each other and heads down and reading and going through bibliography. And you wouldn't believe the number of manuscripts we've had to look at and things we've had to dig out. And some of them, a lot of the stuff is in Arabic. Some of, a lot of it's in English, trying to pull this together. Sometimes you read something in English and go, does it say that? And then you have to go look at the Arabic. And then we have to bring in somebody who can look at the Arabic grammar, because his grammar is English grammar and not Arabic grammar. So we have to do it. So, I mean, we've really been immersed. We're just sticking our head out the other side now. And so I'm
realizing that there's a world outside.
There's a world out there, and I would like to have a break and go explore that world a little bit.
Very well. Dan, thank you so much. Chad, thank you so much. Please don't disappear. I'm going to close us in a prayer, and then I'll close down the live stream. But then I just want to have a quick word with you before you vanish. So please don't log off just yet. As for everyone else, I hope you've enjoyed this. And this is just my way of saying thank you to Dan, because Dan was my very first guest on my channel. And so I wanted to give him an opportunity to talk about his last book, as he's kind of walking off this particular stage. And I might have him back on as a guest if he gets onto some other stage and some other kind of project. But let's finish in a prayer. So Nisique Dominos. If the Lord himself had not been on our side, now may Israel say, if the Lord himself had not been on our side, when men rose up against us, they had swallowed us up quick, when they were so wrathfully displeased at us. Yea, the waters had drowned us, and the stream had gone over our soul. The deep waters of the proud had gone even over our soul. But praise be the Lord, who hath not given us over for a prey unto their teeth. Our soul is escaped, even as a bird out of the snare of the fowler. The snare is broken, and we are delivered. Our help standeth in the name of the Lord, who hath made heaven and earth. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay. Good night, guys.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.